I'm back, dog.
Oh, it's 5:59.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. This is Now That's Debatable. My name is Fantastic Vasad, and I am joined with my co-host, Geocentric Skeptic. Are you
Geocentric
listening to
skeptic.
me? Cool, I can hear us both in the stream. Just wanted to double check on that before we got too far into it. Seems like everything is working well and doing what it's supposed to. So, how you doing today, Geo?
I'm well, man. Just ready to jump into this topic.
Good to hear. Good to hear. I have our chat up as usual. And as you can see, it'll be popping up on the screen. So if you guys are watching, if you'd like to say hello, just acknowledge the fact that you're here. You're more than welcome to do so. As always, if you have a comment, a question, feel free to shoot that in chat. We're going to be reading out any questions or comments as they come in until we get to the point where they're going so quickly and rapidly that we can't keep up anymore, which will be a good problem to have. With that in mind, we also have our phone number up on the screen in the upper right-hand corner. That number is 202-888-5350, and we are monitoring that, so if you do call in, it's going to come right to our headphones. We should all be able to hear and respond to you accordingly. We do ask that if you do call in, that you turn the stream down, because there is going to be a significant delay, but you'll be able to hear us through the microphones and whatnot, just like a normal phone call. So, without further ado, we're going to be taking on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, aka Russia-Ukraine war, however you'd like to refer to it as. And kind of talk on some things that the media may not necessarily be covering or touching on. We're going to take a different angle than some of the media outlets and whatnot. And if anyone has anything specific they want to ask or comment or us to comment on, like I said, please let us know. Or if you'd like to, give us a call, we're welcome to that as well. So, Gio, where would you like to start?
Let's see here. Let's talk about NATO expansion. That's that's really the root of the problem.
Gotcha. So we can definitely start there. I'm good with that.
Yeah.
So obviously the question is Ukraine going into NATO. Obviously Russia is not the topic of discussion here. So do you think that Ukraine will either be accepted into NATO, or do you think it's a good idea, B?
I'm saying no to both questions. No, it's not a good idea. No, I don't think it'll happen. There's a lot of people calling for it, but Ukraine doesn't currently meet requirements of being a NATO country. The country is just too corrupt. I think it was back in 2012 they did a poll, and it was listed as the top 3 most corrupt countries in the world.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's some ideas and concepts going into NATO that people would want to keep in mind when we should consider whether accepting countries into NATO and whatnot. Given that the United States has been in NATO, I think there was 5 or 6 countries when NATO was initially formed. Maybe a few more. Do you know right off?
Yeah, I don't remember all the countries that when it first came in. I know United States was a part of it. Most of Western Europe, UK, France, etc. And I think Germany came later on because it was split.
I think I see 11. Germany was 1955. I think I see 11 countries in its initial
Yeah,
founding.
that was only West Germany because at the time it was split in half, right? You had
Yeah,
West
it
and
was
East
West and
Germany.
East Germany. Yep.
Yeah. And so I mean, like, um, NATO. The main purpose of NATO was to, free. Is to protect democracy from communism, and that's changed a lot since the, I guess, the biggest harbinger of, I guess you could say, communist. Even though the Soviet Union was actually socialist, but since the biggest bastion of quote unquote communism has dissolved, it turned into something else. It turned into a a platform for the United States to expand their influence. And
Yeah, and so
I,
it seems to me almost that it started with fairly good intentions of trying to eradicate communism and spread the use of democracy throughout countries, but it almost kind of seems to me, at least my 2 cents worth, is that it's kind of become like a buddy list, if you will. Like it's to the point of like, let's just see how many places we can put American troops, almost, at least for the United States.
yeah, especially like, I mean, this really started back in, I mean, back in the '90s. I mean, when right when the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, there's a lot of debate going on about, bringing in, a consolidated Germany, because it was free from the Soviet Union. Then in 2004, it brought in the three Baltic states, those being, was it Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia.
Yeah,
And
let's keep in mind that also in 2004, Bulgaria, Romania, and Slovakia and Slovenia all came into NATO.
yeah, they came in as well. But with those Baltic states, the reason why they're important is because they share a border with Russia, so you can put troops right on Russia's border, right? And it's kind of far out. It's not as close to Moscow as Ukraine would be, but it is. I mean, there's, or you can. I mean, you can literally walk from Estonia or Latvia into Russia. You could just march right in. So that was a major concern of them. Ukraine is a bigger concern, even though I think it's much less likely for them to get in. Ukraine just doesn't meet the criteria to join NATO. Like, one of the things, like, I think, I don't remember the entire list, but you have to have a free and functioning democratic, political system. It talks about, like, fair treatment of minority populations. Um, um, you know, your government being mostly free from corruption. All governments are corrupt to an extent, right? So, but, like, I mean, the United States has corruption in our government, but it isn't to the extent that you would see in a lot of other countries, whereas you're expected to pay a bribe to get something done, right? Countries like that don't belong in NATO.
Right, and
Oh.
NATO even has like they call it a map, a membership action plan, in which there are steps you can take and requirements that they have to for countries that are considering or attempting to join NATO, and there are requirements that are involved. So it seems that. And as far as I can tell, there's two countries currently participating in the membership action plan, and Ukraine is not one of them. So,
Yeah, and that's good, I think, because, I mean, Ukraine does not fit the mold for NATO, and I'd argue that Turkey doesn't either. But, I mean, that's a discussion for another day. But regardless, I know libertarians have been, like Ron Paul, have been saying for years that, NATO expansion is going to lead to a more and more, like, antagonistic Russia.
yeah, and I mean,
And
maybe rightfully so on Russia's behalf, as weird as it sounds. But it seems that the when building a political and military assistance program such as NATO that is primarily focused on military and defending each other, having a bunch of people in such a pact or in an agreement, and then surrounding those people or surrounding another country with those people, almost seems passive aggressive.
I mean, the only part that I would disagree with is maybe the passive part.
Well, I mean, given that it's a defensive pact,
It's
I mean,
aggressive.
I mean, it's a defensive pact. I mean, it's kind of
Yeah,
like
yeah,
putting walls
sure.
up, in my opinion. It's in and of itself, it's defensive.
Sure, but NATO's conflicts haven't always been defensive, or at least the defensiveness of their action has been on some very shaky grounds. So, um, sometimes it gets kind of difficult to defend some of the things they do. But and then if you talk about their individual members, um, that's another thing altogether. I think most NATO members oppose the Iraq War, but United States, I think UK, France, that they were all in there. So I mean,
Yeah, but I mean, like,
Russia looks at that.
I think depending on how you determine an offensive versus a defensive positioning to start the war in Iraq, that could potentially play a hand into it, because just because someone's providing assistance doesn't mean they're doing it strictly on behalf of NATO.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I was saying. Like if you look at the actions of the individual members, and some of these policies and these wars conflicts definitely aren't defensive. So like I'm not blaming Iraq on NATO.
Yeah, fair enough.
I'm talking about United States as an individual member,
So
and United States is in NATO and the most powerful and influential member. So
yeah, so in regards to the Ukraine and Russia, as far as, do you think that Russia wants to keep Ukraine out of NATO? Is that what the war is about, or is that what the uh, I guess invasion is about?
definitely, I mean those who were remember back in like December when Putin started putting those soldiers on Ukraine's border. He was saying they're not backing away until we end these NATO talks, right? And that's largely because even though most of the most of NATO's most influential members didn't wasn't taking Ukraine membership very seriously. Like even Joe Biden just came out and said no, he's not gonna um, support Ukraine joining NATO, right? But there were a lot of calls for it. Russia was seeing that, especially in Ukraine. A lot of people was pushing for it. Remember back in 2014, I think their president, I forget his name, but he was ousted because he refused to sign a trade agreement
Yeah, his
with the
his name
EU.
is very, very complicated and hard to pronounce, and I would butcher it.
Yeah, and so he was very pro-Russian, and so they ousted him, and put in the current government, who's very friendly with neo Nazis, and became very anti-Russian. I mean, that was essentially Putin's justification for annexing Crimea, because there was because Crimea was mostly Russian. So yeah, I mean it's that that is Putin's main concern. He doesn't want NATO troops right on his border. Like consider this. Like what if the Warsaw Pact was still around? And that's the for my listeners who don't know that's the Soviet Union's um, counter to NATO, right? So they made a defensive pact with Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. pretty much all the Soviet republics. And
15 as well.
China didn't officially join, but they said they would take part in it. So they were like an unofficial member. But so imagine if members of the Warsaw Pact were included Canada or Mexico in their ranks. That would put Soviet troops right on our border. Right, that would be a serious security concern. Right, and you disagree?
I don't disagree, but I think going to the extent of invading Canada to eradicate those troops would and undoubtedly be an act of war. And
Oh yeah, of
so,
course.
I mean, like
I'm not.
if you, I mean, essentially, what how I'm seeing is that essentially Russia's doing like a preemptive strike on the off chance that Ukraine could have potentially been accepted into NATO. And
Yeah,
that
I
doesn't
mean,
seem like it's
essentially,
a
and
good
I
thing by
think.
any means.
Sorry, go ahead.
I said it doesn't seem that that's a good thing, at least in the terms of
No, it's not a good
unnecessary
thing.
war.
And like in this hypothetical scenario, it us invading Canada or Mexico that wouldn't necessarily be justified. But I would understand the concern. And I mean, considering the relations with the Soviet Union, at some point it may be justified. Or like in some sort of preemptive war. I'd be careful about calling this invasion right here preemptive
I mean,
because
I don't see a better way to describe it.
well, the way I would define preemptive, kind of like this. Remember the 6 Day War that Israel was fighting Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, a few other countries, right? So that war, Israel actually delivered the first blow. What happened was all of those Arab countries lined up their troops and tanks right on Israel border. Like they were getting ready to invade. They were prepping and everything. And Israel's like, okay, screw y'all, and just started dropping bombs on them.
Hmm.
So that's what I would consider preemptive.
I mean,
And when
in the case of Ukraine and Russia, I mean, Ukraine hasn't even joined NATO, and the considerations, as far as I can tell, we're still at best in infancy. So, what's the
yeah,
difference in that and actually lining up troops?
from for me, this is an offensive war. So because a
So
preemptive war is
you
still
think that
defensive.
you think that instead of it being a preemptive strike, you think it's just Putin going on the offensive and just straight up attacking first, saying, I'm going to strike first. It's not a matter of defense for Russia, it's a matter of offense for Putin.
So Putin's policy, or his policy, is defensive,
Okay,
but
but you don't
this
get to
in
strike first in a defensive position unless it's a preemptive strike, which is what I was saying.
well,
So it's either a
no, I
preemptive
mean
strike
because
or it's an offensive
the threat of
attack.
war. I mean, the threat of war wasn't imminent. Like in this case, it wasn't even realistic, right? So 'cause it's unlikely that Ukraine would have joined NATO, and then even if they did, that doesn't mean that NATO's all of a sudden going to attack Russia.
Well,
That's
no,
that's
so
why I
what
was saying it's not
like
preemptive.
but logically from the standpoint of if Ukraine had joined NATO, then they would basically have the defense of NATO and Russia could not then attack. It was preemptive because if they had waited for the Ukraine to join NATO, if that were to happen, then Ukraine would then indeed have the backing of NATO. So it
Well,
seems to me like it's a preemptive strike to prevent that from happening. Because now that
well,
they're currently in a war or crisis or conflict or whatever you want to call it, NATO, the possibility of them joining NATO currently while this is going on is essentially zero. It wasn't good before, but now that they're in
yeah.
conflict, there's no way the Ukraine can join NATO until the conflict is resolved. Because I'm pretty sure that's also part of NATO's rules. You're not allowed to do it while you're in active war.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, the my problem is the way I define preemptive is when the threat is like present, like you can see it. They haven't attacked yet, but their troops are lining up on your border, and you just said, okay, they're
Yeah, but
about to
ever
attack,
since
so we're just
Zelensky
going to go
took
ahead.
over as president of the Ukraine, he's been talking about deals with the EU. He's been talking about deals with NATO. So
Yeah,
the
those
threat
aren't
is
acts of
there.
war against Russia.
Right, but if they were to have joined NATO, he would not have the potential to attack Ukraine in the future without ramifications from NATO. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but
Like
so
seems like
like,
if you're going to
but it's
keep
not.
this from
But
becoming a bigger problem
preemptive
for
wars.
Russia, then this is what you
Yeah,
do.
but yeah, sure. So I mean, I guess he is preempting um Ukraine's membership in NATO, but that's usually not how that term is used when people are discussing it in international relations. Well, when they talk about preemptive wars, they're talking about a country that is still fighting a defensive war. It just happened to have delivered the first strike.
It just
Like
seems
the
to me
classic
like
example is
if
what I was
we're gonna
given with
blame
Israel.
the
When
potential
this
of NATO,
enemy,
go ahead,
and again,
go ahead.
well, I was saying like the classic example is when, like I said, when the enemy troops had lined up on Israel's border, and Israel just decided to go ahead and start bombing them.
Yeah, I was just pointing out the fact that it seems to me that if you were in Russia's shoes,
Hmm.
and you were trying to the whole subtopic that we were talking about, the one we started this on, was NATO expansion. If you wanted to prevent NATO expansion by drawing Ukraine into such a crisis or into the war or conflict or whatever, you would effectively prevent NATO expansion. And doing so
I,
before Ukraine joined NATO would be the only viable option for Russia. Because if Ukraine were to somehow get admitted into NATO, then they would
mhm.
therefore have the backing of NATO, and that would be very bad for Russia. So if you think that the cause of the war or the cause of Putin's invasion into the Ukraine is to stop NATO expansion, then it's a preemptive strike to prevent NATO expansion from happening in the Ukraine.
Sh- Sure. I mean, like the way you're using it, it's about as non-standard as Bush's use of the Iraq War, because that is not how people usually use the term like preemptive strike. But in that sense, in a literal sense, sure, yeah, it is preempting um, Ukraine's membership in NATO.
So
It,
ultimately, what would be
it
the
just implies things.
ramifications? What would be the ramifications of Ukraine joining the EU, or sorry, NATO, not the EU?
It would mean that troops could be right on Russia's border, and so
What about
they
for
would
everyone
lose a lot of
else?
this. Say it again.
What about for everyone else? What about for everyone but Russia? What does that mean for everyone else? Because we mentioned that it would be essentially a bad deal for Russia because then they would have troops literally at their doorstep. What about for everyone
Yeah.
else involved? So the other 30 countries that are currently part of NATO. What does that mean for them? What does that mean for the Ukraine?
Well, for everyone else, it means having a country that's for a substandard military. All right, so it, I would say it would mean the weakening of NATO. Considering how corrupt it is, it opens the door for um, more corrupt countries to come in, and it creates that same environment as you had talked about at the beginning when you were saying it's turning in almost into like a gentleman's club. Like
Yeah, so you think basically that if the Ukraine were to be accepted into NATO, it's basically just another let's deal our cards out to who we want in the game.
kinda. Yeah, do you remember? Was it Montenegro?
Yeah, Montenegro.
Yeah, I think they joined in, was it 2015,
I'll tell you, 2017.
2017.
Yep.
So have you seen like their military strength?
It's small because it's a small country.
It's it's very small. They got about 2,500 troops.
Yeah, I mean
They
the same thing
have
can be said for a lot of countries in Europe, though. I mean, like for instance,
yeah.
like Luxembourg, which is one of the smallest countries out there. They have the one of the richest economies in the world, but they don't really have a standing military per se. and it's
Yeah,
just
and
it's
so like I mean,
non-existent.
countries.
Like
Yeah,
most states could easily conquer most of the European states that are within NATO. Like
yeah, but
the military bases in specific states are larger than the entire military economy and or faction in some of these countries.
yeah, like, the thing is like you don't want like you don't want countries joining NATO that can't really contribute much. Like that's why it's kind of like for Montenegro, like their military, they have like 2,500 troops, 11 helicopters, and about 100 jeeps. Like that's a joke. That's not. I mean, there's not a National Guard unit. Like this Rhode Island National Guard
Mm-hmm.
is like several orders of magnitude more powerful than the entire Montenegro military. So like, why are they in there? So and
Well,
that's
so
the
I mean,
problem.
obviously, it seems to me that it's very beneficial for Montenegro to be there. It
Yeah,
just
of
doesn't seem
course.
very
Yeah,
beneficial
because
for countries with large
you got
militaries, such as the United States, for Montenegro to be there. So the real
you got
question
free defense.
to me is why would the United States want to bring these other countries in? Because it doesn't seem it seems more like a give than a lot of take. By
Yeah.
giving
So
countries like Montenegro a defense equivalent to the United States, the other 28 countries in NATO, but Montenegro provides little to zero political or military assistance to any of those countries in any other way. At what benefit does it what benefit does it behoove the United States to allow them in NATO? Or well, I know it's a collective, but the
mhm.
United States and the other countries with larger militaries,
It's
which would include like
geography.
Germany, the United
Yeah,
Kingdom,
yeah.
Spain.
I
Spain
I
has
think
kind of dwindled, but yeah, still.
the benefit is geography. Like I was saying earlier, NATO has become a launching pad for the United States to spread its influence, and that's what Montenegro would be. It'd be another place where we could um, position troops or move them. I mean, like logistically, it could be useful, especially in a war with a country like Russia or Iran. So that's the benefit that they get, and Putin sees that. And from a tactical standpoint, Ukraine would be very helpful for potential invasion of Russia, and it doesn't even have to necessarily be an invasion. You know, it could just be the threat thereof. You know, now all of a sudden Russia loses some bargaining chips when it comes to spreading their own influence, and Putin sees that. He's afraid of that. There's talks of uh, that he has ambitions of restoring, the Russia to its old Soviet Union glory, and that may be in the back of his head. I don't know. I'm not going to play mind reader, but what he's doing right now, it from from the perspective of a leader of a nation, it makes total sense that he would react this way. I'm not justifying, not saying that it's good, but I understand why he's doing it.
Fair enough. So I think we've kind of fully expanded upon NATO expansion there. That may also go into a little bit about what does Russia ultimately want. I think we should briefly, if it's okay with you, cover the possibility of Ukraine joining the EU, and then we can kind of go over what Russia ultimately wants and what the best outcome for Russia, what the best outcome for the Ukraine, and what the best outcome for NATO and the EU, if you'd like, and then what the U.S. should do about it, if anything, and then we can just wrap it up.
For sure.
So, what about Ukraine joining the EU? So obviously the option was potentially on the table a few years back, um, where Ukraine was considered as an option for joining the EU. Do you think that's a good idea?
No.
No. Uh,
It's not a good idea,
do you,
and
do you think that
and like
the
you said
Russian
earlier,
option was better?
it's almost impossible now. Like
Yeah,
it almost certainly wouldn't happen.
yeah. So I mean, ultimately, it seems that by this whole at least past what 8 years now since 2014, things have just been kind of falling apart as far as options of joining things like NATO or the EU for the Ukraine. But what do you think that it would be detrimental to Russia if the Ukraine were to join the EU, or do you think it wouldn't matter too much? Because it seems to me that the way kind of Russia's been working. So obviously, one of the big problems that Russia had with the Ukraine was they were running natural gas lines and oil lines through the Ukraine to get to Europe, and that's their major export. So that's how they get their money. And running those lines through the Ukraine means that Ukraine charged taxes and tariffs on that oil and gas that they were piping through their country. But as of this year, supposedly, Russia will have completely bypassed Ukraine for their exportation, and therefore bypassing the tariffs and taxes that are coming along with going through the Ukraine. Do you think it would have any impact at all on Russia if they join the EU?
I think so. So like, Russia gets um, they're one of the main exporters of oil in the world. I know, and I know
Yeah, there's a
also
pretty interesting map that provides like Germany, for instance, one of the largest economies in the world.
mhm.
They're top five, if not top three. But one of the largest economies in the world. They get like 99% of their oil from Russia, and there's a direct
Yeah,
pipeline from Russia to Germany.
yeah, and so and another thing to take into consideration is that um think about the Black Sea, how much oil is in it. I mean, there are estimates that it holds 10 billion barrels of crude oil.
Mm-hmm.
Like imagine that, 10 billion barrels. So, in the event of a war, NATO could it if Ukraine was in it, if NATO had access to Ukraine's territory, they could severely impede Russia's ability to extract oil from there. And also their navy that's even patrolling the Black Sea as well. I think Russia has at least one fleet. I know they have at least one fleet, but it may be two that's patrolling the Black Sea,
Mm-hmm.
and that be even more problematic, right? Because you can't fight wars without oil.
Yeah, so I mean,
And
obviously, that's why at least part, if not most, if not all, of the reason that Russia annexed Crimea is because
hmm
their ties and their link to the Black Sea were almost a funnel point because Ukraine has, if not all the access, but they had about 85% of the access to the Black Sea from the European side of things, at least.
yeah,
It's also why
yeah.
Russia went to war with
Russian.
Georgia a few years ago.
If
Well,
you look up, I'm sorry.
I was just saying that why the Russia Georgia conflict happened a while back. Same
Yeah, because
issue.
if you look at like on a map, like you'll see that Russia's access to the Black Sea is like this really small, um, section of land, and from Ukraine, it's huge. You get this huge chunk, of area that provides easy access to it. So I'm sure that's another thing that's on Putin's mind. There's so many things that I mean, NATO bringing in Ukraine, like it tilts almost everything in favor uh, of NATO's direction, as far as like war, as far as strategy, as far as soft power goes.
What about the EU though? Do
Um,
you think
I mean,
economically it
like,
would give such a large hand to EU and their powers over Russia that it would matter if the Ukraine joined the EU, or do you think for in some way, shape, or form that it's possible that the Ukraine could somehow be detrimental or at least extremely impactful to the way that the economy and whatnot interacts with Russia if the Ukraine were to join the EU.
I haven't really considered Ukraine joining the EU. Like I know they were. I'm talking about signing that trade deal, and that's what I mean. That's literally the purpose of the EU is for trade. So,
Gotcha. So I mean, yeah,
I,
I mean,
I
just
I do know this. Like a lot of those EU countries are in NATO. So joining EU will make you that much closer to NATO. I mean, and also, I mean, there's a possibility through joining the EU, Ukraine could be assimilated into NATO. You know, kind of bring it on. If they have to open up their markets, right? You know, because like EU has um, requirements as well.
yeah,
And from what I've seen, economically, they're a little more strict than NATO is,
well, yeah. I
right?
mean,
So like you have
economically,
like
they have a
freedom of
lot of
travel.
standards, which is what their whole deal is that
Y-
they want to be an
yes,
economically they want to be an
yeah,
economic
economically
powerhouse.
free. Yeah, like so like crossing borderlines in the EU, it isn't any more difficult than crossing borderlines of states. Like so, you can go from France to Germany just as easy. You could go from Virginia to North Carolina, right? And so that would, yeah, I mean, that would essentially assimilate Ukraine into the rest of Western Europe. So I'm sure that's a concern as well. I mean, it's not something that I had considered prior to you mentioning this,
No, well, fair
but
enough. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that's obviously it was on the table a few years back. At least the discussion was on the table because the Ukraine was trying to join the EU, essentially for economic bailout and status. But obviously, um, the previous president of the Ukraine was very pro-Russia, and during the time that it happened, Putin offered essentially its own form of buyout, and that's kind of what happened, which is why Ukraine did not join the EU at that time, even if they had the opportunity. They definitely went pro Russia during that time because the former president was very pro Russia. I don't know that they would have actually been given the opportunity to join the EU if all cards were on the table. I don't know that the EU would have accepted and or put out proposition to allow them to join. However, even if that were the case, it seems that their president at the time would have chosen the side of Russia. So as given the actual case in which he did.
yeah, I mean, it, yeah, and the United States had like no small part in ousting that former Ukrainian president. You know, under the Obama administration, they were actively supporting, you know, ousting that pro-Russian president
Gotcha.
and and putting in an anti-Russian president.
Yeah. So and that's where Zelensky took over. He's
Yeah.
pretty anti-Russia. So I think we can quickly cover what does Russia ultimately want? Why other like I think obviously we've kind of talked about NATO expansion. What is the best case scenario for Russia in this whole conflict backslash war, whatever you want to call it? What is the best possible outcome for Russia? What is the best possible outcome for Ukraine?
Best possible outcome for Russia is to quickly nip this in the bud, take over the capital, take over the country, and annex it as quickly as possible. As we can see from all the reports, Russia does not have the means to sustain a protracted war like the United States did. Like, for instance, we had like two protracted wars going at the same time, you know, for like 15, almost 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq. They Russia can't do that. Their economy was already too weak, and then now they're getting hit with sanctions, and so they got kicked out of SWIFT, and And so that now it's creating a host of problems. Prices are going up. Banks are failing because people are trying to withdraw their cash. Banks in Russia, they're not able to get money for loans. I mean, it's a host of problems. So Russia needs to end this conflict as soon as possible.
Well, so
It,
I mean,
it
I'm going to quote Putin here because I have a quote up. This is a direct quote, and it kind of conflicts with what you think the best possible outcome is, because it's not. It doesn't seem to be what Putin wants in and of itself. He says,
Mhm.
and I quote, "It is not our plan to occupy the Ukrainian territory. We do not intend to impose anything on anyone by force." End quote. So it doesn't seem that Russia, at least Putin, at least tongue in cheek, is saying he doesn't want to occupy the Ukrainian territory in and of itself. He doesn't want to control the
Yeah,
physical land.
that
So,
last sentence, he says he don't want to impose anything on anyone by force. I mean, seriously.
I,
I mean, he has a bunch of
obvi-
tanks rolling into the country. He's
yeah,
telling people, yeah,
obviously he's got an agenda,
he
but
waged a war. Yeah.
I mean, do
So
you think he's just straight up lying when he says he doesn't want to occupy the Ukrainian territory?
yeah, I mean that's the
So
I mean
you,
that's the only way that he could seriously, use Ukraine as a buffer between
so
NATO
as
and Moscow. Let me after that, like what he's just gonna go back. He's
well,
like, all right,
I mean, I
I now
think
that I invaded you, now what?
at least as far as my 2 cents on the matter are, it wouldn't seem to me that by allowing it to remain neutral yet pro Russia, or neutral and with declining and or essentially eradicating the possibility of NATO off the table, that it seems that it's still, because let's say Russia were to expand into the land that is currently Ukraine, all that would do would mean that he's going to be surrounded anyway, because there's no country between him and the current borders. By having
No,
them as a neutral physical landmass, then he does have that actual buffer. If Russia were to take over the landmass that is currently Ukraine, then that would be
no.
gone, because he would then be
Um,
pushed on all sides.
what you want is a buffer between NATO and Russia's major cities, like for instance Moscow, especially. So it doesn't have to be, I mean you could say, like, what if Russia expanded all the way, to the Atlantic Ocean, and and even further, like up into Virginia. Now they have states troops are on their border, right? Because they're like in Virginia. So like that's not where it is. They need a border between NATO troops and these major cities, because that's if you wanted to take over Russia, that's how you would do it. That's how you take over governments. You run into the capital, remove their government, and put in your own. And this is how it would be done. Russia pulling out now without annexing it, he's going to be create more problems for himself, because I mean, if you think Ukraine was anti-Russian before the invasion, I mean, what do you think their attitudes are now?
Well, I
I
mean,
mean,
depending on where you are in the Ukraine, because there's a pretty big dividing line. I forget the name of the river, but the river that runs down by Odessa all the way up through Kiev,
mhm.
essentially is a dividing line in the Ukraine, where you have about 95+% of people living east of that river that are Russian-born, Russian-speaking, pro-Russia, and then everyone else
Yeah,
on
they're
the
ethnic
east,
Russians.
or, yeah, on the west side of that, are Ukrainian-born Ukrainian natives that pretty much hate everything Russia stands for. Now, not every person in both sides of that are going to fit in that credentials, but for the sake of argument, that's kind of the way the country is divided. There is essentially a civil war that's been ongoing since the eradication of the former president, and it's
Yeah.
mainly from east and west Ukraine. So,
Hmm.
with that in mind, would it not benefit if he were to take over up until the river that's running through Ukraine, and then still have more buffer than he currently has? Or do you think he should, like, if strategically, not saying he should, but for the purpose of, if you were in Putin's shoes, would you want to just, once you've reached the river, continue going until you've passed the entire country?
I say you'd have to take over the whole country. Just taking over the part where it's mostly ethnic Russians. I mean, that's not going to appease the Ukrainians. That is going to make them like them. That's going to make them hate Russia even more. That's going to be creating terrorists.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are currently
it's going to be.
I think there are currently 2 cities or territories in the Ukraine that have already sided with Russia, and so they're going to fight for the Russian side. So it seems to me like you could almost say they were annexed, if not, just fighting for Russia nonetheless.
Yeah,
they're definitely counter Ukraine.
Yeah, well, I mean, another factor to consider. Say it again.
I didn't say anything.
Oh, okay. Well, I was saying like another factor to consider. It's the sanctions. Like they're still hitting hard, and Russia's government is suffering a lot. It's taking a major hit. That's why I was saying that they need to end this conflict as soon as possible. Because like, even if they're winning the war, Russia is their people, their economy is all taking a major hit, and so the popularity that Putin has in the eastern part of Ukraine is not shared among a lot of Russians living in Russia, and it's because of this. The wars are becoming very unpopular. You have people who's even that's afraid of the draft, so they're leaving those countries. They're fleeing to former Soviet republics such as Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. So even the people's the Russian people's heart just isn't in this war.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are cases in which
essentially
abandoners of war.
There's some that support it. That's why you see with the Z signal going on. I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with that, but like when you see that Z symbol, yeah, that's saying they support the invasion.
Yeah, there's a picture of the Z symbol that he's talking about actually scrolling through on the screen. It's on the back of a SUV with the Russian flag. If you're unfamiliar with the symbol, that means that you're essentially pro-Russia, the pro-Russian in the conflict. So, that's what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't see it working out. I don't see this working out in Putin's favor either way. Look, Russia is going to come out of this conflict much weaker than they were when they went into it, regardless. Even if they manage to completely take over Russia. So,
what's the best possible
if he's telling the truth,
Ukraine?
right?
So what's the best possible outcome for the Ukraine? The alliance.
To best possible outcome for Ukraine is to completely purge all the Russian troops out of Ukraine and join NATO, which is going to be join NATO. I mean, if Ukraine was in NATO, Russia wouldn't have pulled this stunt.
Right. I mean,
and this will almost guarantee that it won't happen again.
Yeah.
Because it would turn it into a world war.
Right.
Very quickly. So that's Ukraine's best. That's the best outcome for them. Although I think that best outcome is highly unlikely.
So there's 2 topics that we hadn't touched on yet, and I think with the amount of time we have left, there's probably one that's more peculiar and intriguing than the other. Although we could talk about problems with the Ukrainian government if you'd like, or we could talk about should the U.S. meddle, or we could talk about both if you'd like. But I'll kind of leave it up to you and how much time you have and where you want to take it from here, because I think I distracted with the last.
I said let's focus on should the U.S. meddle. Okay. And what?
Yeah, I'm always down for that. And it's a pretty self-explanatory question, mainly one that I had for you, but also one for any of our listeners. Like if you're paying attention and watching, if you happen to be still here and you're watching the show, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, a simple yes or no in chat would be helpful. If you'd like to expand upon that, then by all means you're welcome to do so. But should the U.S. meddle, and what I mean by meddle, the reason I have it up this way, and I apologize for the spelling error I had earlier. I corrected it and it's been fixed since. But um, with that in mind, should the U.S. get involved in any way, shape, or form? Should we have our spoon in the pot, if you will? So, Geo, what's your 2 cents on the matter? Should the U.S. get involved?
Um, the United States, as like its official government, I'm gonna say no. Well, to let me qualify that. So, apart from sending sanctions to on Russia, right? Because this is a violation of international war. I'm sorry, international law, right? UN outlawed offensive wars. Russia, you know, um, is as a permanent member of the Security Council, agreed to those rules. They're breaking their own. They're breaking laws that they agreed to abide by. They need to be punished with that. So, United States acting through UN Security Council needs to go ahead and levy those sanctions on Russia. As far as sending weapons, I'm not for that.
What
Um,
what about sending like weapons and troops to the Ukraine in support? What about like
oh no,
yeah? What about
it,
in instances of like providing feet on the boots on the ground, if you will, in Ukraine?
no way, no way. Yeah, don't ever put So like, I mean, and I've seen a lot of people calling for that, and my opinion on the matter, if you want to help the Ukrainian people, sending aid, money, or even um, getting a rifle and going to fight. I mean, heck yeah, man, go do it. I salute you. Take a flight, get to Romania, and run up to Ukraine and go ahead and join the fight. But as far as the United States getting involved in another um, territorial dispute on the other side of the planet, no, that's not something that we need to do, especially with another nuclear power already involved. That's a bad idea. That's just, that's just a recipe for disaster, right? Because especially when you're talking about like two big nuclear, carriers like Russia, United States. I mean, it's a lot of this international relations chess game. A lot of it is bluffing, right? And all that needs to happen is someone mistakes the bluff, right? We say, oh, Russia, they're not going to do that, and they do it. Like, I don't know about you, I didn't think Putin was actually going to invade Ukraine. I thought it was
Yeah,
just
I
a
mean
threat,
the
and then
issue
he
that I've
actually did
I've
it.
seen on the table
I I,
throughout the
I was
years is
shocked.
that yeah, I mean the issue that I've seen throughout the years is that uh, especially with the Russia Ukraine involvement is that it seems that Putin's kind of just been pushed past his limit, which is where we are now. At least that's the kind of the perspective of what I've gathered from kind of keeping up with this incident over the past 7 8 years. That Putin's been saying if this keeps happening, we're gonna step in. If this happens, we're gonna step in. If this happens, we're gonna step in. And he got to the point where he was tired of saying we're going to step in to the point where he's now stepping in. And I mean, there's obviously issues with going to on an offensive war, and there's obvious issues of concern that Putin has for things like the Ukraine joining NATO. Um, but as far as the U.S. involvement goes, like I think perhaps if we hadn't meddled with their government in 2014 and even prior to that.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
may not be an issue today. So,
I'm yeah, true, right? I mean, that's another thing to consider. Like, I mean, there's too many moving parts. We go over there trying to help, and you make things like exponentially worse,
yeah, I mean, kind of like
right?
going back to our what if we encounter alien life and or what if AI becomes sentient? What if we're not on the same page or we mistake what is our helping to being a detrimental crisis in the Ukraine?
Yeah. I mean,
So, I
I
mean,
mean,
we may have had good intentions when the U.S. essentially toppled their government in 2014 and replaced their president uh, with Zelensky. But looking back now, maybe that wasn't the best idea. I mean,
yeah,
hindsight's always 2020, and we're by no means from the end of this conflict, and I don't think that it's going to come to a good or peaceful resolution, no matter how it plays out on the global scale. However, there seems to me like that the more the U.S. meddles in foreign affairs, the worse things kind of turn out. It hasn't really turned out good for anyone, and I think especially when we're meddling with people on the other side of the planet and meddling with countries on the other side of the planet, that we just can't. It's not like we're walking up to Canada and saying, "Here we are, we can help solve the crisis in Canada." It's we're sending troops halfway around the world, or we're trying to, send aid to, you know, people a whole continent away, and it's not an easy or you know is prohibitively costly, but my 2 cents on the matter is just like we should just stay the heck out. Just
yeah,
stay away altogether in any way, shape, or form. Because I think, I mean, as far as Russia being punished for the situation of being on the offense, perhaps send that to a vote to the UN as to what sanctions are taken against Russia. Don't let it be an individual national decision or basis, because that's not what the UN was for. That's not how the UN was formed. That's not how the UN policies are decided. So don't let it be an individual choosing of what's happening, and perhaps make the punishment more severe if he doesn't back off or if he starts expanding into Europe. But it seems to me, especially in cases where the United States in the past, and I mean I could give clear examples of things like Korea and Vietnam, where we have sent troops, like that's just a bad idea. Historically, it has never worked, and I don't think it would work now. I don't think it would make the situation better. So
yeah. I
sending
mean, you don't
troops is
even
an
have to go back
absolute
that
no
far.
way.
I mean, just look at stuff like 2012. What happened to Gaddafi, right? I mean, at one time Libya was the just before 2011. Libya was the wealthiest country in Africa. Now look at it. Like it's a failed state. It's run by like gang lords and pirates.
This
Like
quite
there's
literally a pirate nation as of right now.
yes.
And it has been for the past couple of years, where people are quite worried, and rightfully so, that anything of value will literally be pirated.
Yeah, I mean it's literally in the same condition that Somalia was in the 1990s. I mean, they did it so recklessly, right? When they destroyed Gaddafi, there was like no sort of order. There was um dangerous chemical weapons laying around and stuff. I mean, and people just got them. I mean, I know this isn't about bombing of Gaddafi, but anyway, just if you look at the recklessness that United States, um, the recklessness that they use when they go on to execute their policies,
Yeah.
it it is not a good idea to involve them in this conflict. I mean,
Yeah, and I think
because
I think that just goes to show at least some of the wisdom and aptitude of the actual formation of NATO, because there are
Mhm.
prerequisites before you're allowed to join. And by
Yeah.
going to places like the Middle East, going to places like Libya, and trying to incorporate democracy from a non-democratic state that is either in now currently piracy, or that was a, I mean, essentially, you would call Saddam Hussein a warlord, but I mean, like he was, mustard gassing his own people. Well, democracy still hasn't taken over in those states. Like, it's just not the way it works, and that's not
No,
how you
not at
like.
all.
Since it hasn't worked, they have no way of possibly getting into NATO with the NATO current standards. So, like, it doesn't seem to me that by the U.S. meddling in the Ukraine that we're going to give them any better chance of joining NATO. And like at that point, like the only thing it's going to do is end up costing the United States lots of money, potential lives of our service people, because if we physically send troops over there, they could very well potentially die in conflict for a war that we do not belong in. So at least my 2 cents on the matter is the U.S. doesn't need to meddle. Just stay away as best as possible. Let the United Nations determine the repercussions for an offensive war that Russia is currently causing, and then implement said repercussions no matter how this is resolved.
Yeah, and that for me, that's totally different from a lot of your private companies that are choosing to no longer do business with Russia. For instance, like Visa, Mastercard,
Or
I think
taking vodka
Pepsi.
down off the shelves because it's Russian
Yeah,
made, stuff like that. Like these are like, and I can tell you, at least in the state that I currently reside, and I won't say where it is because it doesn't matter, but in the state I currently reside, the state itself has taken down Russian made alcohols off the shelves of like liquor stores because they're state monitored and state regulated.
yeah,
The like what some people might call like an ABC store or a spirit and wine store, which is regulated by the state that I currently live in. Alcohol that has
yeah,
been made in Russia has been removed from the shelf and is no longer available for sale. And by the
yeah,
way, the governor has made a creed and made a statement that stores that were selling Russian made alcohol, like at bars such as like any standard bar, like if you go to like Applebee's or TGI Fridays instead of the bar, you can't get any alcohol made from Russia at that bar in any establishment in the state.
mm. Well, yeah, I'm not for the government doing it. I just want the as far as private businesses. I mean, definitely follow like your conscience. Uh, if that's what you think is best, if you think that's going to help the Ukrainian people, or just help the help everyone, And I like the for people to keep in mind that the Ukraine, the Russian people are victims of this just as well as Ukraine. A lot of people who had in Russia who had no more say in this invasion than we did over the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah, and
It,
and
it
that's
just
something
happened to
that
live in that
like
country.
I really really appreciate you bringing up that point, because just because troops are being sent and called and people are, I mean, essentially, especially in places corrupt as Russia and places corrupt as Ukraine, you're being forced into this situation, whether you're a civilian, whether you're in the military, whether you're a bystander, doesn't matter. Like you, as far as I know, it's true that Russia has said like you're not allowed to avoid this conflict if you're part of the military. So by being, an abandoner of war, you're going against your entire government. And like that's in the United States we call that AWOL, right? And that's a huge huge no-no. It's just not allowed. So like by don't forget that like Russian military and Russian civilians and Ukrainian like military and Ukrainian civilians are kind of forced into this situation. It's not something that they've chosen. It's quite literally governments and high powers that are currently in control that are causing the conflict on the ground that is causing innocent lives to die.
Yeah, so So keep in mind that the local Russian lady who's baking bread, for a living, don't it's not her fault, right? So don't persecute her. Don't go and punch your local Russian in the face or something like that.
Yeah.
It's
If you see
not their
somebody
fault.
speaking
This is
or hear
Putin.
somebody speaking Russian and on the street, chances are they had absolutely nothing to do with the cause of this war. Like it's just not. It's A, statistically unlikely, and then B, chances are, unless that person is Vladimir Putin, and I don't know what they'd be doing on your street. But if they were, by all means, you can punch Putin in the face if you can get close enough to him to do so. Anything you wanted to add to this, Geo?
Nah, that's about it, man.
Well, I do appreciate you guys watching and listening. If you're here, in next week we should be back on the Tuesday schedule unless something comes up. We did push it back this week. We had a lot going on in, just our own lives and just kind of working around it as we can. We appreciate you dealing with it with us. Um, and next week we'll be taking on a new topic or maybe rehashing something if somebody requests us to, or if we have a guest speaker. If by any means you would like to join us on a guest call or you'd like to call in, please don't forget you can do so at any point in time while we're live. And we'd love to hear from you on our Facebook page, on Twitch, our YouTube channel. Please feel free to give us comments, feedback, or topic suggestions you'd like to see us cover. Anything else you wanted to add, Gio?
That's about it, man.
All right, let's wrap it up then. We'll see you guys next week.